Hello, everybody out there in Radio Land. We are back. This is Media Ciphers only on 89.1 WIDR or online at widerfm.org. I'm joined now by Emerson Wolfe, who is the chair of Palestine Solidarity Grand Rapids. You may remember last week we ran a story about some of our comrades from Southwest Michigan heading out to the convention. Emerson's also an alumni of WMU, so it's kind of a little bit of a homecoming thing that we got going on here. We're gonna kind of. I know you've had a whirlwind of a week, so we're gonna
Yeah,
kind of just get right into it. First of all, how are you doing today? So we always
I'm
ask our
great.
guests.
Yeah, I'm actually doing really good today. I'm grateful for a short reprieve in between, major protest moments. It was actually a long month and a half for me because not only was I in Chicago for the March on the DNC, I also was in Milwaukee before that for the March on the RNC. So I've been going for a little while trying to organize national protests, and I'm excited to have just a short break.
Yeah, I hope you get some chance to rest, a little bit of self-care and whatnot. So with that, we want to talk to you a little bit about kind of your experience over the last week. So let's go ahead. We're just going to go right into the questions, and kind of one of the first things that kind of popped in my head, given the work that you've been doing, and particularly some of what we were talking about on last week's show. I think there was an interesting dimension to these protests that I think a lot of people, or maybe are more casual observers, don't really pick up on. Just kind of like the diversity of the coalition that was
Mhm.
involved. And while of course Gaza was a focus, there were many different activists and organizations representing issues from climate to reproductive justice, a lot more. Um, but a lot of it again was pushing back, or not, pushing back towards this demand for a ceasefire in Gaza. So I was kind of wondering, as an organizer and someone who was there, can you explain to listeners how principles of solidarity can play out in action, especially with all of these diverse groups kind of approaching this issue from a different angle, but all demanding a ceasefire from the DNC?
Yeah, absolutely. So the coalition is sort of a big tent of ideas, right? We had 270 member organizations that signed on to the coalition with a very broad spectrum of ideologies. The coalition was first formed, well over a year ago, before the Al-Aqsa flood happened. And when it was first announced, the demands were money for jobs, school, healthcare, housing, and the environment, stop police crimes, community control of the police now, immigrant rights, legalization for all, defend LGBTQIA and reproductive rights, defend the right to unionize and strike, and then justice, peace, and equality. But the reality is, all of these issues are deeply interrelated, right? When I say your freedom is my freedom, I mean that our mutual systemic oppression is interwoven under the system of capitalism and US imperialism, right? So, as the Republican Party is hijacked by religious fundamentalists and ultra conservatives, it sort of shifts the Overton window, or the window of what is politically feasible or politically possible, farther to the right, which then forces the Democratic Party farther to the right. So the Democrats have gone from, paying lip service at the very least to progressives to saying the quiet part out loud. We will have the most lethal military in the world, as if we don't already, right? At least when it comes to having the most military bases in the world, or interfering with the most foreign governments, or having the largest climate footprint. I mean, a prime example is the fact that in terms of military expenditures, the US outspends the next largest military in the world by triple. That's insane. So I think the genocide in Gaza is a prime example of the intersection of all of these issues, right? It's a climate issue. So as emissions from chemical weapons and bombs are destroying the water table and devastating devastating the environment, it becomes a climate issue. It's a public health issue. Hospitals have been completely destroyed. There are no hospitals left. Despite being eradicated over 20 years ago, polio is back in Gaza. As Israel continues to use pinkwashing in its narrative to claim to be LGBTQIA plus friendly, they're also targeting, isolating, and manipulating queer Palestinians to become informants. So it becomes a queer issue as well. I think a good example of that is how the Israeli company NICE developed its products to control and monitor Palestinians, specifically queer Palestinians, to target them and to turn them into informants for the Israeli state. And then afterward, this company won a contract with the Ugandan government to help identify queer people and enforce its 2014 Anti-Homosexuality Act with torture and imprisonment. That's not queer friendly. Women in Gaza are being denied access to perinatal care or safe, clean menstrual products. It's a reproductive justice issue. Cop cities are being erected all over the United States right now with the intent of sharing militarized policing tactics between the US and the IOF. So it's a policing, a community issue. The border to Egypt is closed. Gazans, no matter how much money they have, can't get to Egypt. They can't immigrate out of Gaza. So it's an immigration issue, right? We're not letting people seek asylum and get to safety. So when I say your freedom is my freedom, we really truly mean it. The coalition started with a list of demands that united the left, but it was Gaza that truly brought us together. And as the government sort of doubles and triples down on dehumanizing Arabs and aiding the genocide, Gaza becomes the most pressing issue of this election cycle and the most pressing issue for the coalition to march on the Democratic National Convention, because it's a mirror for all of our governmental policies and the collective values that we hold dear and that underwrite those policies. We all deserve better, but it takes examining our actual behavior and aligning them with our values, and then pressuring the Democrats, pressuring the Republicans, pressuring the government as a system to make those changes. One thing that I've said over and over again to people that I organize with is you can't change the system as part of the system. We have to be mobilizing people on the outside. And to mobilize people, we have to learn to work together across lines of perceived difference and recognize that all of our various oppressions are interlinked under this white supremacist, capitalist, US imperialist system.
So just a quick follow up to that, because this is something that I brought up with our discussions with Nora, as well as we're going to be talking to our friend Liano later on in the show. But kind of this idea of progressive domestic policy versus internationalism, and something that I've noted is if anybody who's been involved in movements a long time, there seems to be more of a nascent international solidarity than I've seen certainly in my short lifetime as an organizer. At the same time, we have the selection of Waltz, and they are talking about some of these more progressive domestic policies. So I kind of wanted to just pick your brain about one, just your thoughts on how many of these movements are becoming more inherently internationalist. But also, I kind of said, in a sardonic way, it's like the main message I got from the DNC was Americans can have a little bit of social safety net as a treat. Thoughts and prayers to the victims of the genocide we're going to continue to materially support. So, um, just some thoughts on kind of where we're at as far as the internationalism of these social movements, and maybe even the fear that like kind of domestic progressive policy, at least the small amounts that they're promising, could kind of be used to try to build a wedge in that solidarity.
Well, I mean, they may be promising a small amount of social safety net, but we know that both parties historically underdeliver. So if they're promising a small amount, what we'll actually get is nothing. Frankly, if the Democrats lose this election, it won't be because of the left uniting behind Kamala Harris. It'll be because of their own horrible policies. I think we're seeing this trend toward international solidarity. I think that's one thing that Palestine Solidarity Grand Rapids uses as our points of unity, that unites, different forces and ideologies in Grand Rapids, is we truly are internationalists. We look to our policies on a global stage to see what our government is actually doing, because we get a lot of propaganda here in the United States, and we're so deeply entrenched in that propaganda that it changes the way we think and see our own country. So we can get a clearer picture of what's actually going on by looking internationally. Not only that, we are in an unprecedented time when it comes to social media and access to on-the-ground information, right? That's the real reason they wanted to ban TikTok. Wasn't because it's owned by foreign capital or it's a security risk, but because it's mobilizing massive groups of people toward international solidarity. We can see in real time what's happening on the ground through citizen journalists, and we're no longer beholden to the propaganda that we're getting from corporate media and the moneyed classes.
Well, couldn't have said it better myself. That was, yeah, yes, you hit the nail on all the heads with that one. So I guess I'll move on to the next question. And uh, we talked about reactions to um, reactions to the DNC. And as somebody who was kind of on the ground last week, I just wanted to ask, what were some of the reactions from, working class Chicagoans to the protest, as well as any Democrats or DNC personnel you may have interacted with. It is kind of interesting because, as we mentioned earlier, like there seemed to be a lot of nation support for a ceasefire, but also a lot of pushback on trying to, I don't know, ruin the party that they were throwing inside the United Center. So, kind of just curious as somebody who was organizing there, kind of, what you observed.
So I was really lucky that as part of the coalition, I actually volunteered to go to Chicago 10 days early to help with last minute logistics and outreach. PSGR had been doing outreach for months prior to the actual March on the DNC. We went to the People's Palestine Conference in Detroit. We went to the protest Netanyahu rally in DC to do outreach specifically for this march. But while I was in Chicago, I had the opportunity to go to the historic Bud Billiken parade. Happens on the south side of Chicago. I was actually staying on the south side of Chicago in the Woodlawn neighborhood. If folks know anything about Chicago, they know that that's a historically Black and working class neighborhood. Folks on the radio can't see me, but I'm sure you can assume I'm a white person. And so I had a little bit of internal tension being a white person walking around in these neighborhoods trying to mobilize Black working class folks to protest essentially a Black candidate. And my conversations with working class people on the ground in Chicago were amazing. They absolutely went against any of the preconceived notions I had around what those conversations would look like. We were so well received, not only at the Bud Billiken parade, but as we were canvassing the neighborhood in the week leading up to the March on the DNC. Having conversations with people in Chicago about stopping police crimes and community control of the police. With Sonia Massey's murder recently, this was heavy on people's minds. And some of the best feedback I got was, thank you for doing this. We need to be pressuring and mobilizing against the Democrats. We deserve better. That was the biggest piece of feedback that I got from every single person that I talked to was, we deserve better, right? I can't feed my family. I work 3 jobs. My job isn't unionized anymore. I don't have benefits. I'm terrified of the police. If I call the police, they don't even show up. I heard horrific stories of violence being enacted in communities by police and without any sort of safety around them. And so the response from the working class has been overwhelmingly positive. And I think that the turnout at the march on Monday and the turnout at the march on Thursday really shows that, right? We had 17,000 people marching on Monday. We had 11,000 people marching on Thursday. So people in Chicago and around the country are fully in support of pushing the Democrats back to the left. I think that it's very, very heartening. My experience being in Woodlawn, walking around and feeling like it was a very cohesive community, walking around with my pro-Palestine shirt, with my keffiyeh on, and getting smiles, nods, cheers as I'm walking. It sounds almost insane to say, but the conversations were so good.
Well, that's really heartening to hear, because again, something that we always try to debunk on the show is that like, oh, a lot of like lower income, like working class people just don't pay attention to this stuff. And that's absolutely false. Go hang out on a porch. You're gonna have some pretty robust political discourse. I mean, again, we are essentially the people on the porch anyway. So anyway, so with that, I wanted to also ask, and kind of maybe think about your experience as an organizer, going into this and being at various actions. How did you gauge the response of, the city of Chicago,
Mm.
DNC, and the police to the organized protests? Was there anything that particularly surprised you or stood out?
I'll break this up into three different responses. The first, the response of delegates from the DNC. After Thursday's protest, I was walking around trying to find some food with a couple of comrades, and we walked into a taco shop close to the United Center. Delegates were flooding out of into the streets and had packed this taco shop, and we were largely ignored, frankly. It felt a lot like walking through a crowd of blue MAGA, right? Like they're just as rabid about supporting US imperialism as the Republicans are. We did have one woman approach us and, express her solidarity and express her sympathies that more wasn't done at the DNC. We exchanged contact information, and she said when she's in Michigan, she'd love to support our actions and get involved. I thought that was very heartening. But on the whole, it definitely felt very antagonistic. In the convention itself, you see physical violence. You saw people covering their ears. Like that's such a childish response to being faced with the reality of a genocide happening on the other side of the world that we are responsible for, that our tax dollars are paying for. People ask themselves, what would have done during World War II when the Nazis were invading? And it's like you're doing it right now. You're covering your ears, you're looking away, you're not having these conversations, you're not putting pressure on the system to actually change, and you're completely buying into the propaganda. In terms of the response from the city of Chicago and then the police presence as well, the coalition actually sued the city to get a permit to march because our goal was to broadly mobilize the masses and to get them involved in grassroots organizing, right? Of course, we wanted to put pressure on the Democrats. We want our demands to be heard within sight and sound of the United Center, but we wanted to do it in a way that allowed for families with small children, undocumented people, disabled people to all show up as well. So we wanted to provide some sort of official safety net. So we did decide to go through with getting a permit and working with the city so we could provide some amount of safety for folks. There are a lot of criticisms of that on the left, of that specific tactic for sure. But I think that community organizing is a constant push and pull between immediate gains and long-term movement building. And I think that our turnout on Monday and Thursday showed us that not only was the movement there, but our demands were heard, right? We had sympathetic delegates inside on Monday and Thursday who said that our crowd outside was heard loud and clear, that we were interrupting. On Monday, there were 20 plus buses of delegates that couldn't even make their way to the United Center. It was basically empty inside because we were filling the streets with more than 15,000 people and the buses just couldn't get through. So for us, that felt like a material success. Thursday, Thursday, being able to actually interrupt Kamala's nomination with our loud chanting outside, filling the streets and holding the streets for as long as we could, that's a material success. There was a very large difference between the police presence on Monday and the police presence on Thursday. You know, there were bike cops trapping the protest into, you know, narrow lanes on Monday, but then by Thursday their numbers essentially tripled and quadrupled. You know, I heard one of your previous guests talk about the community relations specialists in the yellow vests who were actually part of the DOJ, right? We treated them like cops, and we can't rely on cops. They weren't there for our safety. They're there to protect property, not to protect people. And so the Coalition to March on the DNC was very proactive and trained over 200 marshals to keep the community safe, to keep them guided on the march, to respond to any incidents of police violence and that sort of thing. I think that, you know, despite trying to work with the city of Chicago to keep everybody safe, the chief of police specifically threw up roadblocks at every single chance that he got. You know, the coalition was denied having an adequate amount of porta potties. We only had 7 for the 17,000 people who showed up on Monday. And these are all tactics to try to diminish the efficacy of the protest. After the marches, we've seen, you know, media releases saying that the cops worked with the coalition marshals to keep people safe. That's absolutely not true. We did not, would not ever, and will not ever collaborate with the police to keep people safe. Our marshals were putting our bodies in between the police and in between the crowds of people to make sure that our undocumented friends and our families and our disabled friends are all safe from police violence.
Well, thank you again for that really elucidating analysis of like what you saw there on the ground and just your experiences. Again, I think a lot of us can just like pick apart what all these big capitalists say on the stage, but this sense of what was actually going on there in the Chicago community around these events is invaluable.
Mhm.
Um, so I think with that, I have one last question. It's more kind of thinking through to the future. As you mentioned at the start, you're at both conventions, and they've now come to a close. Schools are starting back up. I want to give a shout out. Students, there's a new chapter of Students for Justice in Palestine. They're probably tabling out there somewhere at Bronco Bash. I don't know if you can hear me, but solidarity to them. They've been doing really good work. Y'all have been doing some great work in Grand Rapids, and also Kalamazoo Nonviolence Opponents of War has also been putting on a lot of events here in town. And I also think there's a chapter of SJP over at K College. So here in the Southwest Michigan region, we do have a lot, a pretty broad coalition ourselves. And
Mhm.
I kind of just wanted to pick your brain about like, and again, I know maybe you should take a breather first after going to the DNC. But what do you think we should be doing here at Southwest Michigan to move forward, continue organizing to put pressure on the U.S. empire for an arms embargo?
Absolutely. You know, we don't really have the luxury of taking a breather. Gaza doesn't get a break. We don't really get a break either. First, I want to say that, you know, I've been organizing for over 20 years now. And what I've learned along the way is that you cannot let your anger and fear guide you alone. You have to have that revolutionary optimism, and trying to create a world that is just, is safe, is compassionate, and you have to find ways to keep your nervous system calm while doing the work. Um, you know, Palestine Solidarity Grand Rapids does a lot of family-friendly rallies, protests, teach-ins, educational series, that sort of thing. But we also do direct action as well. And I think that material disruption is going to be the next stage of what we need to be doing in order to make material changes, either against the Democrats, the Republicans, or the system as a whole. There are a lot of different campaigns happening right now. I know that WMU's SJP Committee actually shared a back to school divestment training that's happening virtually tomorrow with the American Friends Service Committee. That's at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. So if anybody is curious about how to start a divestment campaign, that's a fantastic place to start. The Anti-War Action Network, which PSGR is a part of, it's a national anti-war body, also has a virtual divestment teach-in on September 21st at 4 p.m. You'll be able to find the link to that on PSGR's social media at some point soon. I don't think the link has been produced yet. But there are also other campaigns that people can get involved in, right? Palestinian Youth Movement has the Mask Off Maersk campaign, which targets the Israeli logistics company to try to make those material gains. The Uncommitted Movement has the Not Another Bomb campaign to advocate for an arms embargo. Palestine Solidarity Grand Rapids, in coordination with Resist US-led War Movement out of the West Coast, as well as the General Defense Committee in Michigan, just put on a teach-in about war profiteers in Michigan. Michigan is really interestingly poised to be one of the fastest growing military economies in the nation. We produce the most armored vehicles of any state, and that's because of our historic automobile industry. A lot of those manufacturing sites are being retrofitted to be turned into military contracting manufacturers. So I think that protesting at the source is going to be a really important way to make those material gains, right? We talk about a diversity of tactics on the left. And a lot of times, what we mean when we say diversity of tactics is we support escalation, we support direct action. But we also do have to include family-friendly actions that help build the cultural consciousness around anti-imperialism and unlearn the sort of dehumanizing propaganda that we've been spoon-fed in the United States since birth. I think it's going to take a variety of tactics to get people plugged in wherever they see a need or wherever they have the skills or wherever they feel most comfortable to start pushing the needle forward. So I think divestment and direct actions and organizing against war profiteers is very, very important, especially as students start mobilizing again. We're going to see a rise in encampments. We're going to see a rise in demands for divestment. But I also see a rise in state repression as all of this happens, right? At the end of the school term last term, we saw a highly repressive response in terms of local police, cracking down on encampments. I think that's going to get worse. I don't want to sound negative by any means, but I think that we have to prepare ourselves and that people have to be mobilizing en masse to keep each other safe and to keep each other in the movement.
Yeah, absolutely. And I couldn't agree more. You got to kind of have that combination of revolutionary optimism with capitalist realism. Well, I'm probably using that term a little bit wrong, but anyway, thank you once again for coming onto the show. I just before break, I want to just say, one, thank you so much for all the work you and your comrades were doing, not only at the last couple of conventions, but everything that's going on up there in Grand Rapids. Y'all are really doing, the really critical educational movement, community building work that creates progress on these issues.
Thank you. Thank you.
And if is there anything else you'd like to say before we go to break?
Yeah, folks can keep up with what Palestine Solidarity Grand Rapids is doing by following us on social media. We're on Facebook, we're on TikTok. Our Instagram is the most popular. You can follow us at Palestine Solidarity _GR on Instagram and most other platforms. We have weekly rallies if people want to get involved. We are mobilizing a statewide campaign against war profiteers. So if there's somebody in your area that you would like to target, get in touch with us and we can help share resources and information.
Okay, well, Emerson, once again, thank you so much for coming on the program.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a great conversation.